For those of you who don't know me, my name is Charlene Margot, and I'm the founder and director of the Parent Education Series here in the Sequoia Union High School District. And as always, we are delighted to see such a wonderful crowd for a special event here at the Woodside Performing Arts Center. So thank you all for coming out. Special thank you to Principal Diane Burbank. Diane, give a wave, yay. And as always, we are grateful to our sponsors, the Sequoia Healthcare District, the Sequoia Union High School District, and here at Woodside, the Woodside PTSA, without whose support this program would not be possible. So we have a lot to cover tonight, and I'm delighted to see parents and some students alike in the audience. A wonderful presentation with lots of content, so let's just get started, okay? I'm going to tell you a little bit about our keynote presenter tonight, Dr. Tauheed Zaman, and then he will come up. So the plan this evening is we'll have about an hour of content, followed by about 30 minutes of Q&A. So hold your questions until then. When you do ask questions, we're going to ask at the end of the program when you're invited to stand, ask your question, and Dr. Zaman will repeat it into the microphone so everybody can hear, okay? One last little piece of bookkeeping. You were handed as you came in a survey, a very short survey. If you would take a moment and fill that out as you're leaving the theater tonight, that would be great. It helps us both plan for future parent education programming and also to help us evaluate the program for both the district and the Sequoia Healthcare District for our mid and end year reports. Okay, thank you. All right, here we go. Tauheed Zaman, MD, is an addiction psychiatrist at the San Francisco VA Medical Center, where he serves as medical director for a team looking after complex pain addiction patients. He is also assistant clinical professor of psychiatry at the UCSF School of Medicine. Dr. Zaman serves on the California Society of Addiction Medicine Committee on Marijuana Policy Reform, and he authored the American Psychiatric Association position statement on marijuana as medicine. Dr. Zaman earned his MD from Tufts University School of Medicine. He completed a residency in adult psychiatry at Harvard Medical School, as well as an addiction psychiatry fellowship at UCSF. Please join me in a warm welcome for Dr. Zaman.
Thank you, Charlene, for that kind introduction, and thank you, Diane, and the district for having me. I also want to say a quick thank you to Dr. Karen Lee, who I initially collaborated with on a talk a few months ago, which led to this talk, so thank you, Karen, for being here. So I'm actually going to start off by breaking a rule, so I apologize in advance to Charlene and Diane. I'm actually going to pause along the way because there is a lot of content and actually ask for questions from the audience. So at those points, feel free to raise your hand, ask me a question, and I'd like to do some of that even though we'll have plenty of time at the end for questions as well. I'd actually like to start by polling the audience a little bit because I'd like to know who's actually here. So who are the parents in the room? Would you mind raising your hands? Okay, so good parent representation. If you're a counselor, teacher, or another educator, would you mind raising your hands for me? Okay, thank you all for being here. And perhaps most importantly, if you're a student in this district, would you raise your hand as well? Thank you guys for being here. I hope it was voluntary. And you guys should feel free to ask questions as well. My name is Tauheed Zaman. I'm an addiction psychiatrist. We're going to cover a lot of material today, and this is a timely issue. That said, before I start off, I wanted to share with you this picture of Haight-Ashbury. How many people have been to the Haight? Okay. That's just about everyone in the room. So until recently, I actually lived in the Haight, and I was surrounded by marijuana, by pictures of psychedelics, of posters, of tie-dye, and it was an interesting place to be an addiction psychiatrist. There were kids trying to sell me pot basically every day. But I actually really appreciated it because it reminded me that even though this is on. Even though cannabis is getting a lot more attention recently, it has been in our communities and amongst people for a very, very long time, with different political and social implications. And maybe now we're starting to have some of the conversations that we should have been having all along in terms of trying to understand how it works, how it affects our minds and our bodies, and some of the regulatory issues that have come up. You guys might all remember Prop 64 from November. So even though I'll be talking a lot about the science, I thought it might be helpful to just keep in mind how long it's been around. So I'm going to guess that the students in the room are pretty used to taking multiple choice questions. So I'm going to turn the tables a little bit. So parents and educators, this is your turn. So I'm going to ask some multiple choice questions. Go ahead and either jot down or think about what your choice might be in terms of the right answer. I'm going to come back to these at the end of the talk, and we'll see how you did. I think you'll feel a lot more confident about your answers by the end. So this is the first question. So the Food and Drug Administration has approved the use of cannabis for some medical conditions. And take a guess as to what these conditions might be. Which one of these is the right answer? Could it be insomnia related to PTSD, which is post-traumatic stress disorder? Is it glaucoma, the eye condition? Is it seizure? Is it NV, which stands for nausea or vomiting related to chemotherapy for folks who take chemo? Or wasting related to HIV? Or chronic pain due to multiple sclerosis? So it's kind of a tough one to start off with, but pick your favorite answer. Don't shout it out quite yet. Okay, we're going to do 2 more questions. When we look at cannabis use, one of the measures we look at is actually past year use. So how many people have actually used marijuana in the last year at all with any frequency? And we look at what age groups in particular have used in the last year. So if you were to take a guess, past year use of marijuana is highest in which group? Is it age 12 through 17? Is it 18 through 25? Is it 26 through 35 or 36 through 45? So go ahead and pick your favorite answer. And we'll come back to why the age question is an important one in a little bit. Okay? I hear some conversations. That's okay. You can consult with your neighbors. And then this is a toughie. So, risk of a use disorder. Use disorder is what we now call an addiction. In the past, we used to talk about abuse and dependence, but these days we use use disorder. Use disorder, so a cannabis use disorder, a real clinical problem with cannabis, is associated with which of the following? Number 1, parental attitudes towards use, early onset or adolescent use, route of administration, so that refers to if you're smoking it, if you're taking it orally, like an edible, or regular or daily use. So this is probably the hardest question. Go ahead and think about your favorite or correct answer or answers. Okay, everyone all set? Okay, we are going to come back to those. This is the lovely San Francisco VA Medical Center where I work. I wish it was always that sunny. It's not. It's a wonderful place to work for many other reasons, fortunately, and I have no conflicts of interest to disclose. And what I'd like to do today is actually tell you about a patient who I saw in my clinical practice, and some of the conversations he had. He was an adolescent in high school at the time, and some of the conversations we had over the year that I looked after him. And we're going to use that to talk about some of the details related to marijuana. We're going to talk about epidemiology. We're going to talk about comorbidity. Comorbidity refers to what mental illness or substance use illnesses might occur along with marijuana use. We'll talk a little bit about neurobiology, though I won't get into too much detail. Clinical presentation, just what it looks like. And then some management and policy issues. So this is a pretty ambitious set of things to get to, but we'll do our best. So let me jump in by telling you about who I was working with. I'm going to call him Kevin, not his real name. And what I'll tell you is that Kevin and I worked together for over a year. Our relationship took a lot of kind of twists and turns, the kind of patient-doctor relationship. And it's hard for me to capture him in a slide, but I'm kind of doing my best. And these are kind of the salient backgrounds. So he was a 16-year-old male of Latin American background and had a lot of issues with impulse control and anger, a lot of issues with anxiety, had been binge drinking on the weekends for basically just about 3 or 4 months, but then more regularly had started smoking marijuana. And this actually is eventually what led him to come in, because he started to struggle enough that his school attendance started to drop, his performance in terms of his grades started to drop, and that's really what led his parents to bring him into treatment with us. And he'd kind of gotten enrolled in the clinic, he was going to groups, his parents were going to groups. Things were going relatively okay when I met him initially, just as the physician, as the doctor who was going to be working with Kevin. And I'll tell you, he was a pretty upfront kind of guy. He let me know early on that he vaped hash oil pretty regularly from a vaporizer, and that he consumed an edible, a brownie, daily at that time. And he thought it really helped him with some of these other issues that he had going on. So, being an addiction psychiatrist, I brought up some concerns about that. I said, well, you're 16, you're using this stuff to help you, I'm not totally sure it's healthy, what are your thoughts about it? And this is what he told me. So this might sound familiar to some of you. I'll tell you, he was a pretty savvy guy. He knew that I'd moved from the East Coast just a year or two ago. And he used it to his advantage, but it really did make me wonder. I mean, was he right? I mean, does everyone smoke pot? Had I just ended up in that type of city or that type of state? It really made me ask those questions. And so I thought it might be helpful to talk a little bit about what the actual numbers look like nationally and then also in our school system. So when we look at cannabis, it is still the most commonly used illegal substance around the world. And lifetime prevalence, so people who've used it at any point in their life, is pretty high in the US, as you might expect. Past year use is highest in ages 18 to 25. So I see some nods and some thumbs up for who got the question right. This is actually really crucial, because what we know from neurodevelopment is that our brains actually develop till the age of just about 26. So the fact that there are young adults whose brains are not fully developed yet, who might be using the highest amounts of marijuana, is of some concern. So we'll talk about that age group a little bit. Past year cannabis use disorder, so that's actually having an addiction to cannabis, is also highest in that group, so 21 to 26. The rates of abuse and dependence, again using those old terms, has been increasing. And then this I thought was really interesting. There's some data that the rates of both cannabis use and cannabis use disorder, or CUD on that slide, have actually been going up more in the states that have medical marijuana laws than the ones that do not. And so that's just some interesting epidemiologic data to look at. This is a graph of national data just showing you the rates of marijuana use in the general population. It's the blue line that's second down, and you can see that that's been steadily increasing over the last 10 or 15 years. And interestingly, that same study also asked people, what was the first illicit substance that you ever used? And you'll see marijuana is really highly represented there. That's the big blue piece of the pie, with over 70% followed by pain relievers. So I often get the question from folks, well, is this you saying that marijuana is a gateway drug, that these people all started with marijuana and then went on to use something else? I'm not saying that, because what they did not actually account for or take any data on is, well, how many of these people then went on to use regularly? How many of these people then went on to use other drugs? They actually didn't collect that data. But this is just to say it's often the first substance of use for a lot of folks. When we look at students, so this is getting more specific to kind of the population that we're looking at, the numbers are relatively low, but they're increasing. This is data from a national study by the University of Michigan. They looked at 50,000 students, and you can see that they accounted for the percentages of students in the 8th grade, in the 10th grade, and in the 12th grade who reported daily marijuana use. And this is daily use. And you can see that those numbers have steadily been increasing over the last 10 to 15 years. And this is closely mirrored by a softening of attitudes towards the use of marijuana. So they asked those same students, how many of you actually disapprove of using marijuana regularly? And you can see that number has slowly been trickling down. So when you look at it kind of head-to-head just for 12th graders, over time you can see that the blue line kind of shows you how many people have daily use, and the orange line shows you how many people actually perceive it to be risky, and you can see they pretty much mirror each other. So what is my takeaway from all of this data? I think data are really helpful in that they make us think about some concepts. My takeaway personally is that we need to just be aware that softening of attitudes, that legalization can have some impact on the perceived risk, on the rates of marijuana use, and that might just be something to be aware of, particularly as we're a state that just passed Prop 64 last November. In terms of district-specific data, I'm sorry, the text is a little bit smaller. This actually is data from the California Healthy Kids Survey, and I'm grateful to Charlene for sharing this data with me. But when you actually look at 9th graders and 11th graders and look at those who reported use anytime in the last 30 days, you can see those numbers have actually been declining. So this is the opposite of the national data. You might remember from the numbers kind of going up. In this particular district, they've actually been trending down. So I'd be really curious to hear why you guys think that might be. Is it students just feeling like they can't report it accurately? Is it education? It could be any number of things. Numbers are trending down. Is this microphone cutting in and out? Can you guys hear me okay? It is cutting in and out a little bit. I see Megan working on it. Similarly, in the Sequoia Union District data, all of those numbers are trending down when you look at past month use amongst 9th graders and 10th graders. And so I thought it might be helpful to know what the numbers look like in your district, and the fact that even though they are kind of trending up nationally, here they tend to be trending down. And I'm not quite sure how to account for that. So I'm curious to know why that might be. And actually, since we may be switching out my mic, let me ask, does anyone else have any thoughts about why that might be? Let's ask ourselves. And what I'll say is whenever we see an adolescent or an adult, anyone who's using marijuana, we do get a thorough history of, okay, what else are you using? Because the rates of comorbidity or using something else tend to be pretty high. Any other thoughts about why these numbers might be looking lower in this particular district? Yes, they're in the back. So I think your comment was that social perception makes a difference, and we should pay attention to what kind of environment this reporting is happening in. Is that correct? Yes. I agree with you. So that gets to the question of, well, people might report something and then just be doing something completely different in terms of their practice, right? And I think that's really important to be aware of. Whenever we do these kind of studies of populations that might be in kind of a position of less power in some ways, which certainly students might feel when faced with administrators or kind of survey administrators, that kind of thing, we want to keep in mind that this may not reflect real practice, so something helpful to keep in mind. Any other thoughts before I go on? I thought I saw one more hand. Yes. So I saw several nods around the room, and so I think the comment was that there's a lot to do. Kids have a lot to do. There's a lot of structure, a lot of focus on extracurriculars, and maybe that is protective in some way. So I could definitely see that argument as well. It's helpful for me to hear, just being less familiar with this particular school district, why those numbers might be looking down. I think those are all valid reasons. Maybe one more, and then we'll go on. Go ahead, sir. So I think the comment was about socioeconomics. So the fact that the housing prices have gone up, that the demographics of the area have changed, all of that could certainly play a role. What I will say is, interestingly, I didn't show this data, but when we look at kind of racial and socioeconomic differences in terms of marijuana use, there actually nationally aren't huge differences between different socioeconomic groups or classes, but locally there certainly could be an effect there as well. So all interesting kind of stuff to know about. But getting back to my case, getting back to Kevin, right? He said, well, welcome to San Francisco, everyone smokes pot, right? And if I were being facetious, what I would say to him is actually the minority of people are smoking pot around here, though that number might be going up, and particularly for adolescents, that's something to be aware of. And so, I shared that I didn't exactly share that data, but I shared with him that, no, I don't think you're right. I don't think the majority of people are smoking pot. In fact, I don't think the majority of people your age are smoking pot, though some are. And I have to tell you, he wasn't very impressed. And so this is what he said next. He said, well, great, thanks a lot, Dr. Zaman, but I gotta tell you, a lot of people with mental issues smoke pot. So I have anxiety, I have anger issues, and this really helps me. I see some nods around the room. Have other people heard similar things, that it helps with other psychiatric or mental issues? Yeah. And so this made me wonder, is he right? Do people who smoke marijuana regularly have higher rates of other maybe substance use issues or other mental illnesses that they might be kind of using the marijuana for? So kind of like the self-treatment hypothesis, right? And so this is a study that's a little bit hard to read right off the slide, but I'm gonna describe it to you, so bear with me. So this was a large study of just about 35,000 people, and they interviewed these 35,000 people. I will say these are all adults. Interviewed once between 2001 and 2002, and then again between 2004 and 2005. And what the researchers were looking at is if someone was smoking pot during the first wave, the first interview, were they more likely to have a substance use issue at the second interview 3 years later? And what they found were significant associations with SUD, which is having any substance use disorder, CUD, which is cannabis use disorder, AUD, which is alcohol, and nicotine dependence. So again, association is not causation, but their finding was that if someone at the earlier time point was smoking marijuana, they were more likely to have another substance use issue at the second time point. Interestingly, they did not find any new mood or anxiety problems amongst these people, possibly because of that short time of follow-up. But what we do know is that comorbid, or when I say comorbid, again, I mean co-occurring, mood and anxiety issues are more common amongst people who have cannabis dependence. So on the x-axis there, hopefully that's big enough for you guys to read, you can see a whole host of different mood and anxiety disorders. So everything from depression to mania to hypomania to social anxiety. And the blue bars show you the numbers in terms of people with marijuana dependence, and green the general population. And you can see that the numbers are much, much higher in those with marijuana dependence. And also, please don't strain your eyes looking at this data, but I wanted to highlight the parts in yellow for you. While I was at Boston Children's Hospital, we had a chance to do a study just looking at adolescents and saying, amongst our adolescents who come in with cannabis use problems, are there any associations with other substance use issues? And you can see that we found significant associations with alcohol abuse and with cocaine dependence, and also with ADHD and any behavioral disorder and any psychiatric disorder. So what is kind of my takeaway from all of that data that I just walked you through? My takeaway is that comorbidity or co-occurring disorders, whether or not someone is self-treating or not, is very, very common. So whenever we see someone who might be struggling with a marijuana issue, we should be asking the question as educators, as clinicians, et cetera, about what else might be going on. Could there be a mood or anxiety disorder? Could there be another substance use issue? We should be asking for and screening for those issues. So I just wanted to kind of make that point. Yes, go ahead. I really appreciate that question. So the question was, have there been any studies about whether or not there are associated reductions in alcohol use or opioid use amongst these folks? Is that correct? So we don't have any data, any kind of hard evidence around either, but there are early trends that states which have medical marijuana legalization actually have lower rates of opioid use in the general population and lower opioid-related overdoses, which, as you guys know, is a big deal. We hear about opioid overdoses all the time now. So there may be some interaction between kind of the cannabis and the pain systems in our bodies, but the data is really, really early, and there are trends, no actual big studies showing those associations yet, and none with alcohol so far. Okay? There has been so much written about marijuana and the risk of psychosis that I have to tell you that even as a physician, I struggle to hold all of it in my brain at the same time. But I think there are some important things to take away. They are as follows, and I think it's important to just remember these 5 points, that regular cannabis use, and by regular I mean daily use, is associated with increased risk of a psychotic outcome. And what do I mean by psychotic outcome? So psychotic outcome means the early symptoms of schizophrenia. It means emergency rooms, hospitalizations related to paranoia, to psychosis. So all of that is more likely. There's a dose-dependent risk, so if someone smokes or uses daily, they're much more likely to experience psychotic symptoms. For people with a history of psychosis in their family, maybe someone else who's had schizophrenia or another psychotic disorder, it speeds up the onset of psychosis by about 7 years on average. There are higher rates of paranoia and hospitalization and lower brain volume. So what do I do with this information, right? I will tell you, I am not a fan of scare tactics. I don't like hitting people over the head with this information and saying you should be afraid of marijuana because of psychosis. This is general population, but it does include adolescent data because prodromal psychosis often occurs in late adolescence and early adulthood. So the way I talk about this data, and I talk to folks about it, is particularly around the risk of kind of hereditary psychosis. So if someone has a family history of psychosis, if someone has had a relative who has experienced psychosis, if someone has a personal history of a psychotic episode in the past, I do talk about this risk. I talk about the fact that, look, we can't be 100% sure that it's going to happen, but using daily or using regularly does increase the risk of some kind of psychotic episode happening again if you have a family member and, again, the genetic risk or a personal history, okay? So I shared all of that with Kevin, probably within the first 4 months that we were working together, and he remained unimpressed. And he said, well, great, no one's crazy in my family. No one is psychotic. He called everyone crazy, unfortunately. No one has psychosis. I'm not a schizophrenic, so I don't think I need to worry about this. And he said, I'm going to keep taking it because for me it's like medication. This is actually what he said. He said, it's labeled like a medication, so I know exactly what I'm getting. And what he was referring to was that he actually had gotten some medical marijuana from a friend of his who had a medical marijuana card. And the marijuana containers were labeled. They were labeled with the percentage THC, the percentage CBD. And he essentially said, look, Dr. Zaman, you give me medications with medication bottles that have labels on it. This has labels. This is medication. So I know exactly what I'm getting. So this led me to ask the question again, was he right? I mean, did he know exactly what he's getting? Are these labels accurate? So I wanted to discuss that issue next. This is a picture of trichomes. Trichome comes from the Greek word for hair, and it refers to those small translucent outpouchings that you can see on the leaf in the picture. These outpouchings are attached to glands within the plant, and those glands secrete all the different chemicals, THC, CBD, all the different cannabinoids that are psychoactive, that have some activity in our brains. And every form of marijuana that you're going to encounter, whether it's the smoked product, whether it's hashish, whether it's hash oil, whether it's tinctures, has found some way of extracting the chemicals from these trichomes and putting it in some form for consumption. So it might just be, I thought it might be helpful to just see where it all comes from. And when we look at what's in there, it turns out there's this entire alphabet soup of different chemicals in there. So these are cannabinoids. I won't go through all the acronyms, but at last count, there were approximately 100 of them, and we don't know what the vast majority of them actually do in our systems biologically. The two that you might hear about most commonly are THC, or tetrahydrocannabinol, there in the bottom left, and CBD, or cannabidiol, there in the bottom right. Have folks heard of THC and CBD? Have those terms come up? Yes. Yeah, I see a few nods. In general, even though this hasn't been tremendously well studied yet, we think that THC might be more associated with the quote-unquote bad stuff, so the risk of addiction, the high, et cetera, and CBD may be more associated with some of the good stuff, so the anxiolytic or kind of anxiety-reducing effects, some helpfulness for pain, but really the research just isn't there yet to kind of rigorously prove that. Those are just kind of anecdotal data. And this gets into neurobiology. This might feel like science class, but I won't go into too much detail except to say that cannabinoids, any of those kind of alphabet soup of different chemicals, once they get into our body, actually act at the neural receptor. So they act in the neuronal cleft, and they affect the way that our brains kind of communicate between nerves. And these receptors, you'll see kind of that squiggly line that says CB1. CB1 and CB2 receptors are actually all over the brain. So someone asked me, okay, what part of the brain are these receptors in? Where do these cannabinoids actually work in our system? And the answer is, and again, don't strain your eyes, but I wanted to show you, this is a map of everywhere in the brain those receptors are, and the answer is they're everywhere. So those cannabinoid receptors are in every part of the brain, which is why cannabis can have effects on everything from memory and learning to motor function, all of that. So it's all over the brain, and that's really kind of the take-home point there. I wanted to talk about brain maturation. I enjoy talking about this topic because it feels really relevant to working with adolescents in particular. And the brain matures from the back to the front, from the occiput to the frontal lobes. And by maturation, I mean myelination. So those nerves are kind of growing to development from the back to the front. This picture here on the right shows you that maturation process. You can see that the little brain is slowly turning from green to blue, kind of going from the back to the front as it myelinates. Now, this is important because the frontal lobes, these parts of the brain right here that are the last to finish myelinating around the age of 26, are the parts of the brain that we associated with kind of being good adults, for lack of a better term. So they're the parts that are associated with decision-making, with planning, with other executive function, with risk-taking, all of that, and those are the last to form. So when you're 12 to 14, the cerebellum, which is the back part of the brain here, myelinates. And so that's motor function. And what that makes me think of is, does anyone here watch the Olympics? Any kind of Olympics fans here? It makes me actually think of the gymnastics portion of the Olympics, where you see these incredibly young athletes who are kind of doing twirls and spins and pommel horses and just incredibly coordinated. And the reason they can do that is because that motor part of their brain has fully myelinated. It's fully formed, even though they're quite young. Around 14 to 18, so mid-adolescence, this is the limbic system, or the social emotional part of the brain. So this is, this is peer groups, this is young love, this is Romeo and Juliet, this is the emo teenager that some of you may know, perhaps some of you were at one point. All of that is 14 to 18 years old. And then finally, the frontal brain, which is 18 to 26, develops. So that front part of the brain is the last to develop, and that has to do with thinking and with cognition. So this is why doctors in particular are so, I think, adamant about protecting the developing brain, because those executive functioning parts of the brain are the last to develop around the age of 25 or 26. So this is just an animation showing you that process that I thought was kind of cool to look at and drove home the point. There are some studies, and I won't go into a ton of detail about this study just in the interest of time, showing that, that cannabis use, particularly daily cannabis use and early cannabis use, can have an impact on IQ, and that there can be a drop between adolescent IQ and adult IQ if someone is an early user and a regular user. So just wanted to point out that study to you. I'm happy to talk more about it after, but I'm going to skip over for now. And so then just a little bit of summary of some of what we've talked about in terms of adolescent use and cognition in particular. So the age of onset makes a difference, how often someone uses makes a difference, and the amount makes a difference. Earlier onset and more use leads to poorer cognitive outcomes. When you actually look at the brain and look at the MRIs, there are structural differences, and really exposure during this vulnerable period before the age of about 25 or 26 can lead to altered brain development. And all of that is well and good, but I have to tell you, for Kevin and for any of the other adolescents, or even just general patients that I see in my practice, they're not super impressed by all of this theory. They're kind of like, okay, well, what's the actual impact? What are the actual outcomes that we're talking about? And I will say that regular and early cannabis use is associated with some grave outcomes. So it can be associated with lower rates of high school completion, lower rates of university degree attainment, higher rates of cannabis dependence, higher rates of illicit drug use, suicide attempts, depression, and welfare dependence. Now, again, I want to pause and say that despite this slide, I'm not a fan of scare tactics. However, if I see someone who is really, really motivated and really wants to complete high school, who wants to go to a college that they have their heart set on, or who wants to get a job that they're interested in, who wants to be independent from their parents or move out, or if their parents want the same, I talk about these things. I feel like it's part of my job to let them know, hey, these are some of the trends. So again, it's highly individual, but I'll talk about some of this stuff if it's relevant for the person I'm working with. I want to pause there and see if there are any questions about any of what I've covered. And I saw a whole bunch of hands go up. Can we start at the end? Yes. Yes. Yes, so I think your question might be, you hear that it's not addictive, but is that true? I'm gonna say that's coming up in about 4 slides, whether or not it's actually addictive, so hold me to it, yes.
Your data show a causal relationship. Are the marijuana users, were they all then going to catch on?
This is an excellent question. So I really appreciate it because correlation is not causation, right? So these are correlative studies. So have they actually gone in and done kind of slices of the brain to see if like the brain is actually altered by the marijuana, therefore leading to these outcomes? No, they haven't done that. The studies where that has been done and functional studies have been done are more related to psychosis. So when you look at the subgroup who have been studied for psychosis, they've had a lot more research done in terms of brain functioning and how it's actually being altered by marijuana to make psychosis more likely, but otherwise you're correct. There's no direct kind of causal link. These are all correlative studies. So that is a good point. Yes. Yes. Yeah. Yes. Uh-huh. Yes. I get this question all the time, and I'll tell you the way I get this question, and I'm curious if other folks get it too, but I get asked all the time, how much is okay? Like, just give me a number. Like how many times a day, how many times a week, what is it? And to be honest, we don't know the information. Part of the reason for that is because it's hard to study. Dose is hard to study because it's so variable. How much gets into your system depends on how deeply you inhale. It depends on your pulmonary function. It depends on the purity of the marijuana. So I share all of that and I hem and haw, and at the end, the person usually says, okay, just give me a number, you know? So what I say is this, I think daily use is probably most highly correlated with problems. So what I say to folks is try not to use every day, try not to wake and bake, and that is usually protective. If people are able to have days off, if they're able to function otherwise without marijuana, that's usually protective. So that is what I say to people. But again, frequency has been more studied than actual dose, and daily use is considered probably more risky. Okay? All right, I'll just take a couple more. Yes? Yes. Yeah. Sure. Uh-huh. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I think that you always have to look at the source of the data. So what I can tell you is that the studies that I've picked out to the degree that I could are from the kind of most reputable medical journals, which actually also kind of has a bit of a bias, right? So this is the medical perspective, right? This is not kind of the social justice perspective, and I have to tell you, if I had my social justice hat on, I might have a very different perspective. I'm here to give you the medical information. To the degree I can, I've also tried to pick the studies which are large studies with large populations, or studies that summarize the data from large numbers of other studies, so meta-analyses. So I think the best that I can do is give you the data from the most reputable journals, the largest possible and most inclusive studies, and the studies that seem like they're not tremendously biased in terms of sponsorship by pharmaceuticals, in terms of kind of outside interests coming in. So I'll say that I find myself pretty middle of the road, but if you find me otherwise biased, please let me know or call me out, because I'd be interested in the feedback. Yes. The risk of psychosis, it decreases significantly after 26 years old. Prodromal psychosis tends to occur, like the early symptoms of psychosis, tend to occur around the age of 19 to 21 for the most part, and really after the brain is fully myelinated, there's a reduced risk. That said, because I work in an addiction clinic, I see some really, really severe cases. So for people who are very, very heavy users, I have absolutely seen adult onset psychosis. So people in their 40s, 50s, and 60s who have new onset psychotic symptoms from marijuana, but I think that's relatively rare. Okay? So I'm going to go on, and we'll have plenty more time for questions. So I thought it might be helpful to just talk about some of the preparations that my patients talk about, that we might all encounter, and what they actually look like and where they come from. And so marijuana, there's certainly the dried plant product itself. So the leaves, the stems, the flowers, these are typically smoked or vaporized. I think most of you guys are familiar with this or have encountered it in some form. Then there's hashish. Hash is basically a concentrated resin cake. So you might remember the picture of the trichomes that I showed you earlier, so those leaves with all of those translucent outpouchings. When those are dry sifted and those trichomes are removed and the chemicals concentrated into the solid cake form, that is hashish. And kind of the important thing to remember there is that all of those chemicals are more highly concentrated in hashish. And then there's hash oil, which is basically those same trichomes have been melted off using a solvent of some sort. You might hear about kind of dabs, and dabs involve some form of highly flammable liquid, which has been used to basically solvent extract those chemicals. Because you melt the chemicals off, you evaporate the liquid, and you get this visky kind of oily substance that is really high in chemical concentration. Now, what's the problem with trying to evaporate a highly flammable liquid? I see some laughs. So yeah, you're correct, I assume, if you're thinking fires and explosions, so that does happen. And I've actually had colleagues who are emergency room docs in Colorado who've talked about people coming in with burns, et cetera, from trying to make their own hash oil. And then you get infusions. So infusions are plant materials just mixed in with different solvents, used for baking, used for other kind of making of different products. Occasionally, again, in keeping with these sometimes really, really spectacular headlines, you get really severe intoxication syndromes. This was one that caught my eye because it said synthetic marijuana overdose turns dozens into zombies in New York City. So I found this a little bit sensationalist. You don't often see marijuana and zombies in the same headline. But this was actually a response to synthetic cannabinoids. So I'm not talking about synthetics a lot here. You guys may have heard of spice. You may have heard of K2. Those are synthetic forms of cannabinoids that are much, much, much more potent than the natural varieties, and occasionally can lead to these really scary-looking intoxications. But I'm not going to talk a ton about that here. Cannabis withdrawal can also occur. So within a week of stopping, if these symptoms occur, someone has cannabis withdrawal. This is a medical diagnosis, but I'll tell you, I've seen it myself several times now, and it can be pretty disturbing. And it's most likely to occur in someone who uses daily. So usually 3 of these within the first week. So a lot of issues with irritability, anger or aggression, difficulties with anxiety, sleep issues, changes in appetite, restlessness, depressed mood, and at least one of these physical symptoms. So abdominal pain, shakiness, sweating, fevers, chills, and headache. And I've seen this occur several times, and it can occur if someone goes from daily use to not using at all. And finally, there's cannabis use disorder. So these are the 11 criteria that we use to diagnose any substance use issue these days. In the past, you may have heard of abuse or dependence, so alcohol abuse, alcohol dependence, cannabis abuse, cannabis dependence. We no longer use the terms abuse and dependence. Everything is now a use disorder. And depending on how many of these criteria you meet, like the doctor goes through the checklist, you either have a mild, moderate, or severe use disorder. So these criteria actually exist in the medical literature. And then this is kind of the crux of the matter. Who ends up getting addicted? How many people end up getting addicted? So this is data from NIDA, the National Institute on Drug Abuse from 2012. And so it turns out when you look at all users, really the extreme minority of people end up developing an addiction at any time in their life, so 9%. When you look at people who start in adolescence, that number jumps up to about 17. And again, when you look at daily users, depending on the study, it's between 25 and 50%. So what is my takeaway from this? It's been kind of what you've heard probably as a theme throughout this talk, which is that, again, overall, probably for the general population, not tremendously risky in terms of addiction, but early use and daily use can be risky and associated with an increased risk of addiction. In terms of the pharmacology, I'm not going to go into the details of a lot of the medications, except to tell you that there are now currently 0 FDA-approved medications to help people stop using marijuana. That said, those of us who actually work in the field do use some medications off-label to help people use, and these have been associated with more negative urine drug screens, with fewer symptoms of cannabis withdrawal. Gabapentin is one of them, NAC or N-acetylcysteine is another. There are some other drugs which are actually cannabinoids themselves, so synthetic cannabinoids that have been shown to help, but I have to tell you, those are prescribed almost exclusively by oncologists, so people working with cancer survivors or people undergoing chemotherapy or kind of who have severe HIV or AIDS-related illness. So I do not prescribe these medications, but they are out there. What about treatment in terms of behavioral approaches? There's really good evidence that behavioral treatment, group therapy, works really well for people trying to get off of marijuana. So CBT, or cognitive behavioral therapy, works really well. Motivational interviewing or motivational enhancement therapy works well. Contingency management, which might be an unfamiliar term, but actually refers to rewarding people for not using. So people getting negative urine drug screens and then getting some kind of reward has been shown to be both effective and cost-effective. And then group therapies of different sorts do work. So those are just a kind of a whirlwind tour of the different treatment options. So where did I end up with Kevin? This is where we ended up. He ultimately said he did cut down significantly, as I said, and he started doing kind of functionally a lot better. But he said, I don't want to stop. He said, I don't want to stop. It's a good treatment for my anxiety, but we can keep an eye on it. We can keep talking about it. And I have to tell you that different physicians will give you different opinions on what they think is a good outcome. For me, this was a perfectly good outcome. The most important thing to me as a clinician is to be able to talk about this, to be able to have honest, open conversations about what someone's using, what their goals are, how it's affecting them. And the fact that he was doing better, that we could continue to talk about it, for me was a success and was a perfectly successful outcome. So just wanted to mention that. But what about the medical indications? He said, it's good for my anxiety. So what about the use of medical marijuana for anxiety or any other psychiatric illness? When I was at the American Psychiatric Association a few years back, we did this kind of months-long review of all the literature around different psychiatric conditions and whether marijuana is useful or not. And I can boil all of the findings down to you in the one line, that currently there are no psychiatric indications for the use of medical marijuana. Not anxiety, not PTSD, not depression, nothing. But really, the reason for that is a lack of study. It's not studies showing that marijuana is ineffective, it's a lack of actual adequate research. So that's really important, and we made the point that you guys, and by you guys we mean the federal government and the DEA, need to be letting more people study these issues and these diagnoses. It's important to note that there are some non-psychiatric reasons that the FDA approves the use of cannabis products. So again, that's nausea and vomiting related to chemo, or anorexia and wasting related to advanced HIV. These are some common medical illnesses that I get asked about all the time, so I just thought I'd mention them to you. I get asked frequently about seizures and about epilepsy. This has gotten a lot of press in the last couple of years. There's some early evidence that childhood treatment-resistant epilepsy can be improved by marijuana, but really insufficient evidence for any other seizure issue. There's some emerging data that specific pain conditions, particularly neuropathic pain, might be better with marijuana. And then when it comes to multiple sclerosis, there's a lot of data, and I was really interested to learn that in some European countries, marijuana products are actually first line for multiple sclerosis and pain related to multiple sclerosis. So that said, it still hasn't been adequately studied in the US. So I've mentioned Prop 64 a bunch of times. This was on the ballot in November of 2016. I'm happy to talk more about it, but what I'll say is that this sets up a system of regulation, which we've talked about, of accurate labeling. It also sets up a system of taxation for the state. And this is going to be a windfall for our state. So the estimate is that the state will generate $1 billion, that's billion with a B, in tax revenue per year as a result of Prop 64. A lot of that money is supposed to go to addiction treatment, to prevention of addiction, to adolescent treatment, but there's not a whole lot in the law about who makes that call, about how much of the money goes where. So currently there's a big kind of cash grab going on of different departments kind of trying to get their hands on it and say this is what you should do. Myself and other physicians are involved in kind of really pushing for evidence-based treatment of substance use, and particularly protecting vulnerable populations like adolescent users. So, before I wrap up, we're back to our questions. So the first question was, FDA-approved indications or FDA-approved conditions for cannabis are which of the following? Any guesses? You can shout it out at this point. You guys are correct. 4. Past year highest use is 2. Very good. Okay. And this is the hard one. Risk of use disorder is associated with which of the following? It's a trick question, it's both. It's 2 and 4. So, some take-home points before I wrap up and take questions. So, increasing prevalence with legalization in some of the states with medical marijuana laws, risky for the adolescent brain that is kind of forming from the back to the front, with the frontal lobes being the last parts that form. There are high rates of comorbidity, by which I mean co-occurring other mental illnesses that should be screened for and that we should watch out for. In terms of what's in the marijuana, there's THC, there's CBD, there's a whole host of other compounds and alphabet soup, as I said, that we should be aware of. We actually have medical definitions of what it means to be intoxicated, to have withdrawal, or to have a use disorder. Early use and daily use is associated with poorer outcomes, as I discussed. And then there are some medical indications, particularly chemotherapy-related indications and HIV, but currently no psychiatric indications from marijuana, medical or otherwise. And then legalization has happened. It's happened here, and it's still being implemented. Prop 64 is still being implemented, but for me and for other people working in the field, it brings up questions about how do we protect vulnerable populations that might be kind of early adolescent users, it might be veterans. I work with a lot of veterans as well. I work with people with traumatic brain injury. How do you protect those vulnerable populations? And then also, how do you study this adequately? The federal government makes it very hard to study marijuana because marijuana is very tightly regulated. It is still a Schedule I substance, which means that it's considered highly dangerous with no medical benefit. So that makes it very hard to study because there are so many regulations. And many of us have been involved in efforts trying to get the DEA and the federal government to loosen those regulations so adequate studies can be done. So it's an interesting time to be working in this field. And so with that, I want to share my references. I will email them to you. This is also an eye test. And thank you all for listening.